When you hear the name Rosa Parks, a very specific image probably comes to mind. It's a story most of us learned as kids, a simple, powerful moment on a bus that changed the course of American history. Right? You know the one. It's December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama. A quiet woman, totally exhausted after a long day at work, refuses to give up her seat to a white passenger. It's always framed as this one spontaneous act of frustration that just so happened to ignite the civil rights movement. But what if that story, the one we all know so well, is just a tiny piece of the puzzle? What if the quiet seamstress was actually a trained, strategic, and frankly, radical activist who had been fighting for justice her entire life? Well, that's the story we're going to uncover today. To really find the real Rosa Parks, we've got to start by peeling back the layers of the myth. That popular version of the story, as inspiring as it is, has been called out by historians for being, well, a little too simple. It really obscures who she truly was. So this is the portrait we're usually shown, right? A quiet, almost passive figure, an isolated act that came out of nowhere, a simple case of being physically tired. And hey, she was the very first person to do this, and her story pretty much wraps up after the boycott is won. But just about every single one of these points misses the bigger picture. Historians have even called it a gendered caricature that completely hides a complex and dedicated revolutionary. So let's hit rewind, because long before that day on the bus, Rosa Parks was already a seasoned and incredibly dedicated activist. Her rebellion didn't just pop up in 1955. Nope, it had been building for decades. Just look at this timeline. It shows a lifetime of deliberate action. Way back in 1932, more than 20 years before the bus incident, she married Raymond Parks, who was an activist fighting for the Scottsboro Boys. By 43, she was the secretary of the Montgomery NAACP. In 44, she took on the dangerous work of investigating the horrific case of Rency Taylor, building a whole national campaign around it. And then, get this, just a few months before her famous arrest, she went to the Highlander Folk School for actual training in nonviolent resistance. This was not a random act. This was the result of a life's work. And her role as NAACP secretary, that wasn't just some desk job. We're talking about dangerous frontline work. She traveled all over Alabama documenting violence and injustice, laying the organizational groundwork that the movement would absolutely depend on later. The Rency Taylor case especially brought together all the key elements of the bus boycott a full decade before it happened. And this part is so crucial. She wasn't just passionate, she was trained. Highlander was basically a workshop for rebellion, where activists learned the real nuts and bolts of civil disobedience. And she went there in the summer of 1955. She was, in a very real sense, preparing for a confrontation. Okay, so with all of that in mind, let's look at that day on the bus again. It wasn't an accident. It was a strategic, calculated act of defiance. It was a choice, made by a seasoned activist and a community that was absolutely ready to mobilize. Now, here's the thing you might not know. Rosa Parks wasn't the first. Not at all. 9 months earlier, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin was arrested for the very same thing. But community leaders, including Parks herself, were waiting for the perfect test case to challenge segregation in court. They felt Colvin was too young and her circumstances just weren't quite right. But Rosa Parks, a respected 42-year-old secretary of the NAACP, known for her impeccable character, she was the ideal plaintiff. She was the perfect person to rally an entire community around. And in her own incredible words, she just dismantles the whole myth. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. You see, this wasn't about a sore back after a long day. It was about a spirit that just refused to be broken any longer. It was a profound, soul-deep weariness with injustice itself. Her arrest was the spark, for sure, but the fire was already set. The response was immediate, and it was unbelievably organized. The Women's Political Council had 35,000 leaflets printed literally overnight. The Montgomery Improvement Association was formed, and they elected a young, charismatic pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader. This was a movement that was just waiting for a launch signal. And it lasted for 381 days. Think about that. For more than a year, the Black community of Montgomery walked, they carpooled, they built their own transportation system from scratch. It was an absolutely extraordinary display of solidarity and resilience, all sparked by the strategic defiance of one trained activist. And you know, for most people, this is where the story just stops. The boycott is won, segregation on buses is declared unconstitutional, and the credits roll. But for Rosa Parks, the fight was so far from over. In fact, her political journey was about to get even more radical. Because being a symbol came at a massive cost. Both she and her husband lost their jobs, they were dealing with constant death threats, they couldn't find work, and the pressure was just immense. They were eventually forced to leave Montgomery altogether and move to Detroit. And it was in Detroit that her activism just continued to evolve. She worked for Congressman John Conyers for over 2 decades. She was an admirer of Malcolm X. She actively supported the Black Power movement, advocated for political prisoners like Angela Davies, and campaigned against global injustices, from the Vietnam War to apartheid in South Africa. The quiet, gentle icon of 1955 was a vocal supporter of some of the most radical parts of the Black freedom struggle. This quote from 67 just captures her mindset perfectly. "I don't believe in gradualism." She was impatient. She was done waiting. She completely rejected the slow, frustrating pace of change. She demanded freedom, and she demanded it now. So, why does all of this matter? Why is it so important to know this fuller, more complicated, more human story? Because the myth, as powerful as it is, kind of robs us of the real lessons of her life. As Professor Myra Pollack-Sadker put it, a womanless history, or in this case, a simplified one, it diminishes everyone who reads it. By boiling Rosa Parks down to a single, spontaneous moment, we erase the decades of strategic work, the training, and the radical thought that made that moment even possible. And this, right here, is the key takeaway. The whole accidental hero myth makes it seem like history is just made by chance. But the true story of Rosa Parks teaches us something so much more valuable. That real, meaningful change comes from relentless organizing, smart planning, and a lifetime of dedication to a cause. Ultimately, it's really on us to tell the full story, to move past the simple symbols and embrace the complex, challenging, and honestly, the far more inspiring reality of the women who truly shaped our world. Rosa Parks wasn't an accident. She was an inevitability forged in the fire of a lifelong rebellion. And knowing her real story leaves us with a pretty important question. Whose full story do we need to uncover next?